So, all right, you've you've got your scenes, you've got kind of your raw data, your life. You've got your scenes, moments that have drawn your attention for one reason or another. And then this question about like, well, what about meaning making? Like, are we just telling people what happened? Um, you know, if I'm forced to say in like 45 seconds what I think this kind of story is, it's a story that's built out of scenes, and the scenes are chosen, organized, edited around what this version of the story is about. What's it about? And try to use that language to avoid language of like theme or point, but it's what's it about? And I do think that church people, people who listen to or give sermons, have kind of a leg up on this understanding of the difference between what happens and what it's about. Um, because you come around to the same texts, lectionary or not, you come around to the same texts again and again. And based on where things are in the world, the congregation, the preacher's life, what it's about changes. And the way you get at what it's about, um, in my experience, happens sort of two primary ways. One, we're in the middle of a sermon series, and so this text better be about something that relates to the sermon series. So I'm going to like go into the text and look for it. And the other way it happens is I am more freely, preaching on a text. I'm not trying to, I'm not responsible, uh, for like ferreting out something specific. And I'm going to kind of let that text wash over me and, discern what it's about for us at this time. And for me, those two ways of figuring out what it's about, kind of going in looking for something and kind of openly discerning, the same is true with my own material. And I have similar responsibilities with storytelling. So sometimes I'm putting together a story that's on a theme because there's an event, and because the kids are going on a trip, we've chosen the theme journeys. So I'm looking for something that's about a journey. Um, Other times there's a more, I'm putting together a story. I don't need to find a specific theme, and I pay attention first to like, oh, these moments, there's something here. So something I'm still not satisfied with that I started working on a couple of years ago is that I have this collection of moments about singing, me auditioning for things and not getting it, not being in some settings a very good singer, being in other settings like terribly inadequate, whatever. And so there are these collection of moments which are compelling to me, like they draw my attention. I think they say something about who I am and how I interact with the world. But I wasn't sure at the beginning of the process what that version of the story was going to be about. And I needed to come up with something because I ended up performing, it was for a performance. But honestly, I never got to a place yet with those moments about singing. The people I was working with, they had a suggestion that I could kind of like wrench this set of moments into a meaning that was about, well, you started a church, so you made a place for your voice. And I was like, gosh, I hope not. What a terrible reason to start a church. That seems, wrong on every level. But there did end up being something about the church being a place for many voices, like including mine. Like, yes, I am very much making a place for where lots of people can be heard, their stories or their singing or otherwise. So that's the second piece of for me, for storytelling. It's that they're made of scenes, and they're organized. Those scenes are organized around what it's about this time. The other thing that's connected deeply to what a story is about this time is connected to one of the things I mentioned sort of glancingly earlier. Have said again and again, is what's at stake for the storyteller at the time that it happened. And by like the risk or the uncertainty or the danger, it's something that's posed to that was the storyteller was the one who those things affected. So what's at stake can come from quite a small um, quite a small moment or quite a small example. So these things from the beginning, things that you secretly love and hate, I have questions for you about them. Um, so, from who is that a secret from? One of the one of the ways to reveal meaning in a story is to let people know the stakes. Um, some of it is that same impulse, like this is the thing you need to know. That sense of, that happens even conversationally. You can see that the person isn't quite getting it. You're like, oh, well, okay, the thing you need to know is, some of it is following that impulse. But a lot of these things, and it's true that the thing that's never happened to me is like three people in a row being like, oh, it just doesn't come up. Uh, but for many of these things, there are meaningful, significant, I'll say, stakes undergirding these things. A lot of the things that you shared talked about, how people see me or how I think of myself, or in some cases, it's in some cases it's relational. So well, I knew the whipped cream was a thing because my family teased me about it. It's not a high stakes thing, but that feeling is like a real and important human feeling. And there's a whole range of experiences that fall under, like, if people knew this about me, what would they think? And or if, now that I've done this, now that I know this about myself, like, who even am I? Or now that I have accomplished or been unable to accomplish this, does that change my sense of myself? Does it change my relationship to this other person or this job or this faith? So quite small examples. One of my one of my examples is that a thing that I secretly hate is when people who otherwise have the ability to, that's an important uh, aside, but is that people who have the ability otherwise to don't pick up their feet when they walk, that they like shuffle and I can hear it. And it's a secret from everyone except people that I'm in workshops with, because it's such a nitpicky thing. I don't actually care. Like, people can do whatever they want with their bodies. That's like a deep commitment of mine. Furthermore, the other thing you need to know is that my grandmother, who died like 20 years ago, was always like, oh, young people, they don't pick up their feet when they walk. So I'm just like, here I am at like half her age being like, no, I don't like it. I think they gotta pick up their feet. Like, it doesn't matter. So that's a thing about, like, I perceive myself as sort of gracious and accepting of, and not gracious, but I like to think of myself as gracious and accepting of other people's behavior. but that one, and I also think of myself as not like my grumpy 85-year-old grandma who I love. So there, even in silly or low grade examples, something like, often in these settings, one or more people will name that they secretly love like Hallmark holiday movies. And it's a secret from, like, people with good taste, or like my theater friends, they're super sophisticated and like, it's not there, but they're so enjoyable. So it becomes about, identity, relationship. But this came up this week also. There's no way of knowing that your listeners have that same sense of good taste. Your audience might be full of people who are like, oh, well, Hallmark Christmas movies are great. I love that. What's wrong with Hallmark Christmas movies? They're charming. I love that. And so the thing that they need to know is, I hang out with these like sophisticated, snobby friends who think that they have great taste and they think that I'm like on their level or whatever. And you guys, I love Hallmark Christmas movies. They're so good. And my friends would find this so embarrassing. So you've revealing the stakes is also about thinking, like, how will I let someone else into this story who doesn't share this set of assumptions? This week, a friend told a story about running into an acquaintance while she was meeting with her new boss for the first time in person. And she became sort of like racked with anxiety that this acquaintance was going to out her as having told a story at some event a couple of years ago about this really like outrageous date she went on. but she didn't behave outrageously in the story. Like she went on a date with someone who was sort of like deeply unsuitable and himself was like totally outrageous. And frankly, I'm the kind of person who's like, well, what's wrong with that? You didn't do anything wrong. You just told a story about a bad date. So for me to like, and you can't account for all of those things, but for me to join her story more fully, I needed to know something like, in professional circles, I do not talk about going on dates because frankly, that's a professional boundary I don't keep. Like, so for me to come closer to her experience, I needed to understand uh, perhaps more explicitly why this had the potential to like out her to her new boss. Again, in my mind, I'm like, what, for someone who goes on dates sometimes that don't work out, that seems fine. Um, so it's letting people know what they need to know so that they can join you in the moment of like, oh, that's weird. That's quick and dirty on more or less on stakes and what a thing is about. Does that, I wonder what questions or ideas that raises for anybody, or because I kind of blew through it, if there's something that we should go back to. Is there anything you're wondering about? So even while you're still writing, let's keep talking. I wonder if there are folks who would share out loud or in the chat some of the words that describe you.
This is Rosemary. I had down things like reliable, talkative, sensitive, outgoing, conscientious, empathetic.
Marvin, engaging people, changing, meaningful, and I cheated on the last one. It's mostly joyful.
I don't think there's cheating in storytelling. I think that's good.
Stephen.
Anybody else? You don't have to share.
I'll share. I listed pragmatic, adaptive, grounded, patient, and creative.
Does anybody pay attention to on social media or otherwise the guy Brandon, whatever his name is, who does Humans of New York? Is that familiar, Miriam, Kara? Would one of you be willing to describe what that is, like in whatever form you engage it in? What is that project?
Humans of New York was started by a man, I think his name is Brandon, and I follow him on Facebook. And the way he started was just taking pictures randomly of people in New York, and hence the title, Humans of New York. And there would be a short story behind the picture that he took. Sometimes it was just a photo, and sometimes it was more. And it's grown to the point where he has a book or two, I believe. And most recently, especially during the pandemic, he would focus on a character. Usually they're in New York City, and tell a whole background story. And there would be multiple sessions or Facebook posting, 1 of 5, 2 of 5, 3 of 5, telling the story of the person accompanied with photos. And most recently, he has, again, New York City, offered stories of resilience in New York City, of hope, of coming back from COVID by focusing on small business owners and people who have kind of had a really rough time during the pandemic and are now just kind of like coming out of that. So that's it in a nutshell, but it's mostly been photos and then accompanied by the stories.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. So a question that I had about his work, Brandon Stanton, today is the day I learn it for real. as Miriam said, they're pictures of strangers. And the text that accompanies it when it does is part of the person's story that's often quite personal and in depth. And I wondered like how he arrives at, I mean, these are truly people that he like encounters on the street and takes a photograph, and then these personal, often regularly stories that include trauma are part of the text that he shares. So I heard him, or I watched a video of him, to be clear, speaking about his process. And one of the things he does is when he approaches people, he'll ask a question like, if you have a motto that you live by, or a rule that you think is like a rule of life for you, what is that? And sometimes people will say, you know, you should always be forgiving, or always look on the bright side of life, you know, whatever their little personal or motto or framework is. And he sometimes then says, when was a time when it was hard for you to forgive? Or when was a time that it was hard to look on the bright side of things? And there are a couple of ways that I think about this kind of question. One is that I think about it in terms of a question that runs against the grain. So for these words, any one of them could have a whole bunch of stories associated with them. It's kind of like the 6th grade English class version of this workshop. I mean, I think a lot of it boils down to 6th grade English class, but like, show, don't tell. I believe that you're reliable, but if I watched you living your life, how would I notice that you're reliable? If I watched you in a couple of instances where you indeed were reliable, what would I see? For my money, that's a question that runs with the grain. Like, yep, you're reliable. So let me see it. I want to see you being reliable. Then there are questions that run against the grain. So normally you're a reliable person. Was there a time, when was a time, to Ed's question, when was a time that you either failed to be reliable or weren't reliable in the way you wanted to be, wished you didn't have to be reliable? So questions that run against the grain. Both of those are useful directions, generative directions. The ones that run against the grain point me to the second way that I think about these questions, which is that areas of tension, areas of decision making, sort of forks in the road, those are often rich locations for story material. Something is at stake, sort of necessarily. You're choosing between two things, or there's a tension within you between my, you know, value of believing in people's bodily autonomy and my irritation when people who could don't pick up their feet when they walk. There's like everything from like a little bit of tension to a lot of tension. So these lists of words, I'm a people person. I'm mostly joyful. Mostly joyful already has built into it both with the grain and against the grain. Like mostly joyful, and then these are the ways where joy is hard for me to access, or you know, whatever, my joy is limited. So each of these words could have multiple sets of stories associated with it. So to think about yourself as a main character and think, how would I demonstrate this? Is a case of like starting with an idea and moving toward scenes, as opposed to starting with scenes and moving toward what it's about. These are, you know, I'm going to tell a story about reliability, and then thinking about what are the moments that would show that. So that's a way to get to stories. And it's a way, when I'm working with other people, I do want to talk about that a little bit, sort of inviting storytellers and working with storytellers. If somebody's like, I know I want to tell a story, but I've got nothing, a sort of like, you know, 0 to story move is to say, well, so tell me some words that describe you. And then say, what is a time that you were, like, what are some moments from your life when you were particularly adaptive? You know, presumably this year as a pastor in a pandemic, but are there also other moments when you've been you know, kind of an adaptive personality? Is that something that runs core to you, or is it something that you learned this year? Whatever. So you can ask questions either of yourself or of a potential storyteller, which is another reason that storytelling in congregational life is, for my money, a rich practice, because it ends up being quite a pastoral practice, or connection building practice to talk with someone about their story and ask those questions. So how about some of the jobs that you've done, the jobs you've had, work you've done? What do people have for that? Are you willing to share? You can put them in the chat too.
I had a summer testing lubricants. I always like to throw that one out there and let
Amazing.
people's imagination.
Now, is that like automotive or AI, like animal veterinary kind of work, or what do you?
Compressors. So like refrigerant compressors, and then we also had like landfill compressors, which that was really disgusting.
Sure.
So we measured viscosity and acid content of the lubricants. So
I remembered one that was like this little minor blip, but as I was thinking about it, my dad worked for like a pet food company for a while, and one of the jobs my brother and I had was to create sample packs of dog biscuits that he would take on the road for like shows or whatever. And so my brother and I, like 5 biscuits, closed the Ziploc, and like a whole winter break or something, we did that for money in the basement of our house. Crazy.
I got paid $1 for folding the bulletins when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Which that was like the 80s. That was a ton of money. Sharon?
I remember in Oregon in junior high and high school picking beans and strawberries, which all the kids in McMinnville, that little town, would go out early in the morning and wait for the school buses that were rented, and you go out and do that. It was amazing. Yeah. You didn't have to have a college degree to do that. When I came back from college in the summer, I'd go out and pick beans. And it reminded me why I was going to college.
Did y'all take your own lunches with you?
Yeah, peanut butter. It didn't go bad in the heat. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Peanut butter sandwiches.
yeah, Ed.
I got a list of things here. Warehouse worker, did that a lot. Taught over at Eastern Washington Ute for a couple of years. Bookseller. The most meaningful is being happily retired. And for a time I was a panhandler.
Yep. Yeah, Disney. So there's overlap. I have many musician friends who worked at Disney doing shows. Miriam, you also played the harp at Disney. Amazing. So of course, like looking at this list, there are many stories that I want to hear from these. How'd you end up, driving a little forklift? How do you, and even things that, it's like, well, everyone's done that. So harvesting beans and strawberries, everybody where I grew up did it, but other people didn't, so there are windows into worlds that people don't have access to, which are my favorite kinds of stories. Like, this is deeply regular for us, but like, but that's only because of where we were from. There's value, like, oh, so many people have worked in a coffee shop, like there's nothing there. You can ask the same kinds of questions that run with the grain and against the grain. Factual questions. How'd you get that job? Who else worked? Kind of going back to our first, where were you? Who else was there? What happened? Who were the customers? Who was the boss? How'd you get the job? What time do you have to get there in the morning? But you can ask these questions too that run with and against the grain. In what ways did this work suit you? In what ways was it like a super ill fit? And sometimes, somebody at one of these who's, ordained for, years now, working as a pastor, talked about being a barista at Starbucks or something, and said that it was still to date his favorite job, and it was the job that suited him the best. And we sort of we talked that day about their jobs, pastoring included, where just there's never like really an end point. You're never like done. And you're like, like there are lots of professions that are like that, where you don't really exactly ever set it down, at least not mentally. And I connected with him about like, yeah, my favorite job ever was cooking. I was in charge of this big vegetarian weekly lunch at the divinity school, and I shopped it and planned the menus and ran the crew and did the dishes. And at the beginning of the day we started cooking, and at the end of the day we were done. And I could have done that for the rest of my life. It was great. Did not pay very well, but otherwise, I love that. So thinking about those kinds of identity questions and what was meaningful about it, why was his coffee shop job his favorite job ever? So you can ask those, like, sort of the factual questions, which for many jobs are interesting. Just when did you professional harpist, like how did that happen? How'd you get a gig at Disney? All of that factual stuff to someone who's not a harpist, who hasn't played at Disney. Like, I'm like, yeah, tell me all of it. And you're like, oh, well, this is how all the musicians who work at Disney are, but like, nobody else knows that. And then also those sort of underlying things about the work. Amazing. Steve has had unpaid work as a harp carrier, which makes a lot of sense. How about are there any things that you want to share off that list of places you've lived? That my feedback about those is the same, but are there any places you want to name that you've lived?
Interesting. This category created the most stories in my mind, thinking about like I ended up writing, like the house I grew up in Lemon Grove, California, that is much bigger in my memory than it is when I drive past it and see it today. So yeah, just that the places I've lived were telling stories.
That's great.
I lived in a very small town. We had a total of about 25 residents, a one-room school.
Amazing. A fifth wheel trailer on the property of you say Yakima Mission for one summer.
Well, I have to live with a bunch of old people now. I live in a retirement community with 30 apartments, and it's sort of like being at a dorm at college or a summer camp. And I'm an only child, so I grew up, in a very different environment, and it's a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the same environment in a retirement community, and I love it. I thrive on it around people. But I was thinking that I lived for about 1 or 2 years when I was in graduate school. I lived in a rooming house in the University of Washington district, and that was a fascinating experience. They ate next door in a boarding house with all kinds of strange and wild, wonderful characters. So that was a fun, interesting time in my life.
I wanted to share one more thing about housing. When I was in the 3rd grade, my father was finishing seminary at Bright College of the Bible in those days in Fort Worth. And we lived in a 1-bedroom student housing, 3 children and my parents. They had a single bed, I guess you call it a double bed, but anyway, not very big. And then at the foot of it, we had a bunk bed and then a little mattress underneath. They'd pull out between the beds for the little one to sleep in. And I was lucky because I could go off to cut across TCU campus to go to grade school all by myself in those days. But my 2 sisters and my mother living in that small space was really tough that year. We were really glad to move back to the Northwest where they were from, and we were all from. So yeah, that was a tough year. So I remember that.
Yeah, thank you for these. And if they, all of these lists, like they're sometimes, for me, sometimes the act of making a list like this will remind me of something that I truly haven't thought of in a long time. It may end up not being a story about the place at all, but oh right, that's what was happening in that time period. it might point me to, you know, the way that it sounds like that year in that one bedroom apartment was, you know, sort of a time, not a time out of time, but that it was a sort of exception for you, and sort of, so it might point you in fact to another, you know, to some other story where that's sort of an aside. But as I say, if you're looking for stories, or if you're looking to help others come up with story ideas, that list making, you know, nicknames you've had, friends, you know, friends you've had over the years. I can share this as well. I didn't actually send it to Sandy yet, but I have sort of like a list of lists, you know, that can just be sort of getting into a place of connecting with sort of old ideas that maybe you haven't connected with for a while. Let's see. I want to say, let's see. I want to talk briefly about some things that you could potentially do in your own settings right away, if you want to take up a little bit more storytelling. So I want to kind of hit some things quickly, and then I want to, by within about 10 minutes, I want to move to sort of questions and discussion. I do have one more shorty story that I can tell on our way if we end up with time for that. So Ed talked about the best meal I ever had was versus the best meal I ever had was when. And the main way that comes into practice for me is both in conversation, like trying to get people to specific moments, but the way we use it at church or at storytelling events, it's an idea that we ripped off from The Moth, which is somebody, yes, we'll get into, I'm going to try to do some things that you can do in groups, whether they're small groups or larger groups. So prompts are a way of engaging a whole group of people in storytelling in kind of a low stakes way. And I'm not talking about low stakes stories. For example, you know, my grandpa ordered pizza while we were waiting for them to come get my grandmother's body. That's a high stakes story, but that story was shared anonymously with no preparation. So it's, in terms of the process, it's low stakes. So the way we use prompts at church, pre-pandemic, we had so this is the easiest way for me to sort of picture it. Pre-pandemic, we had little slips of paper that had a half sentence on it. And almost always that half sentence ended with the word when, because when drives people to a moment, which is, for our money, a story. And the example that Ed gave was, if you ask people what's the best meal you ever had, they'll give you food items. And if you ask them to finish, the best meal I ever had was when, they will, in that case, this was like our second church service ever, they will exclusively give you stories of moments, people who were there, what happened. We choose those prompts. And one of the things that Sandy will share with you after this, I have just a piece that I wrote. I always sort of feel embarrassed to have a blog because no one has blogs anymore. It's just a place where I store stuff. Okay. I wrote a thing in this place where I store stuff that you can look at, about prompts and how we get to them. So we use them in every service. People come in and they get a bulletin and this little half piece of paper, this little slip of paper that they're meant to like put in a basket. I apologize if you can hear the music. And then we read those anonymously during the welcome. And we choose that prompt according to what the sermon is, what the theme for that night is going to be. So sometimes they're quite concrete. One of the best meals I ever had was when. And sometimes they're more interpretive. Shit got real when. You know, people, I did a 180 when. I was out of my comfort zone when. I'm just gonna shut the window. Recently, our neighborhood Amazon delivery guy has been really blasting music. It's like, oh, it's the same guy. So people can contribute those anonymously. I can share how we do it online now, so there's no contact. But they're a way of inviting people into the theme for the night, whether it's storytelling or church service. It's a way of inviting people into the theme before they even know what the theme is. It's inviting them into the theme with a moment from their own life. So that's more than enough about that, especially because there's this blog post about it. So prompts are a thing you could, and you can also, I guess I'll keep talking about prompts for a minute. You can use them in a church service, a storytelling event. You could use them at a council meeting where you're talking about a proposal, to give money to some housing organization, or you're talking about like your work with unhoused people. And a prompt could be, before we get started, please fill this out. And it says, I finally felt at home when, or I realized I was home when. So you're inviting people to think about what makes home, because our project here is like, we're trying to raise money for this, but what we're talking about is making home for people, for and with people. You can use them at, organizing events, but I think of it as like getting people into the theme kind of sideways and with their own, by way of their own life. So that's prompts. Two, is that a favorite one that I use in small groups again and again is that there's sort of an umbrella. This is oral, not written. There's kind of an umbrella prompt, which is, if you knew me well, or if you already knew me well, you'd know that I, and then you give people categories. So if you already knew me well, you'd know that I, and the first category is food. And then you give people an example. You could, and for, in my experience, you always want to give people a low stakes example and a high stakes example, and model that people can opt in for as much or as little vulnerability as they want. Actually, I'm not going to do food. The first one I ever did was around Mother's Day. And this was my prayer breakfast at my old church. So I said, so tomorrow's Mother's Day. Will you, I wasn't using the form of prompts yet, but it's kind of like, if you knew me well, you'd know that I, and the category is Mother's Day. I said, and you can tell us where you're going to have brunch tomorrow. Or like in my case, you could say that Mother's Day falls right after your own mother's birthday and you have a complicated relationship with her. And also you wish you had kids, but it seems like maybe you won't. Mother's Day. And then you go around the circle and some people are like, yeah, I'll tell you where I'm going to brunch tomorrow. And other people share much more personal things, because in part because I had already modeled that both are totally fine, and it's up to you how much you want to opt in for. I've also modeled like, we're going to receive some potentially personal things, and that will be okay. So another way to do that, if you already knew me well, you'd know that you can give people categories with kind of slightly increasing that invites greater intimacy. So you can start with something like food. I'm the one who makes the pancakes in our house. When I was growing up, we experienced food insecurity. So what have you got for food? You let people go around for food, and then you say, okay, I don't know what the next one would be, but you can work toward like family. You can work toward relationships. You could work toward something like grief. So you can kind of gradually increase, and you can do like multiple rounds if you've got time, or if it's a small group where your goal isn't to like get to the agenda, but to build community. So that's one that I use. That's one that I use a lot. You can also add sort of a bonus round where, if something that got said kicked up a memory for you and we haven't done a category for it, like go ahead and we'll do one more round. So if something came up that you want to share. So that's one I use a lot. So story prompts, if you already knew me well, you'd know that I. Another thing that I've been using is, this is a book I didn't include on that list, Sandy. There's a book called The Art of Gathering. Anybody read that? Yeah, some folks. Yeah, Priya Parker. I recommend the book in general. And there's this thing that she talks about toward the end of the book, an event that she calls 15 Toasts. And the idea is to invite people without prepping them, which I think is both bold and important, because people can't worry about it ahead of time, and you can model that it's sort of, we're gonna do this thing. You similarly pick a theme, and for Priya's money, something with a little bit of grit to it is more useful than something like "To a Beautiful Day," like to, well, I'm not going to make up her examples right now, but you invite people to tell like a 3 minutes or less story. We're doing it on the theme of, here one night with church people, we did it to like being at home in your body. You say you get 3 minutes, you have somebody who's a timekeeper, so the person talking doesn't have to keep time. They tell a little 3 minute or less story. The person who's timekeeping, if they get close to 3 minutes, they sort of like raise their drink to indicate wrap it up. And giving toasts comes with a gift of having a natural ending. You're like, oh, it's time for me to wrap it up. So as one person said, to fat camp. I learned who I was. I got friends at fat camp. So we all like said, yep, to fat camp, and that's how we ended. That was to be at home in your body. People talked about early morning runs and baths, and this person who'd been sent to what was then called fat camp by her mom. And oh my gosh, there were amazing stories that got told that night. Yeah, somebody got arrested by the police and kept trying to explain that they were protesting. They needed to go to the bathroom, and the police wouldn't let them go to the bathroom. And they completely bled through their clothes into this, they had a period, into this like plastic, like molded chair in the police station. And when they stood up, they were like, well, I told you I needed to go to the bathroom. And so they like took all of her clothes and gave her like a paper jumpsuit. And so we toasted like 2 paper jumpsuits, So toast, and that's a similar thing where you can model vulnerability. When I do toasts, I go first, sort of modeling the shape and length and vulnerability of the story. And Priya Parker suggests that if you're going for something vulnerable, that you lead with something a little more vulnerable than you're hoping people will share. Of course, obviously within what's appropriate for your context and for yourself. So I would say that for me, those are the 3 I use the most often: prompts, that small group opener, and toasts, which I tend to use not for formal events, but for gatherings. And at the new church, we'll do like a group gathers in some neighborhood joint on New Year's Eve and does toasts, like 4 to 6 on New Year's Eve. We do them probably 2 or 3 times a year, and it's like a gathering to make toasts. And that's the structure of it. So those are off the top of those are my top of mind ones. They're the main ones that I use. We've got 29 or 28 and a half minutes left. And I wonder what questions you've got. I left a lot of things out that I planned to do today, but I wonder what questions you've got. What would be helpful to talk about in these last few minutes?
So I'm thinking about my particular context where I might be utilizing some of these storytelling practices. And, I have a very, they're not quite the frozen chosen, but they're not like seriously into a lot of sharing. So how do you kind of get your congregation to dip their toe in the water of storytelling? One of the places I'm thinking would be certainly because we still do an elders meditation before communion. I know not everybody does that, but we do. When we were gathering in person, we had a time sort of right before our closing where I would ask anyone if they had an experience or something they wanted to share, but it wasn't really framed very well. So that was a real mixed bag, although we had some really powerful sharing. I'm not sure that's the right time because people are kind of looking forward to leaving. So how do you get your congregation that doesn't do this to kind of start doing this?
Yeah, I forgot to say, but always should, that I know that people are neither as extroverted nor as forthcoming as I am, and that I don't think that either of those are necessary to do this work. I think from in my experience, so I started doing storytelling in congregations and with my own congregation when I was at this very formal, almost exclusively one percenter church on the North Shore of Chicago, like the northern suburbs. And it was a place where um, like they had never seen anybody like me. It's like, oh no, the world is full of people like me. And that was a place where we like grew into the practice, and there were definitely people who experienced something as overshare that I was like, what? I didn't even notice. I think that by there we did almost no storytelling in worship. We did a couple of storytelling events. So when I said earlier, are you like a food church? Is it stories and pie? Is it stories and music? That was a church with a lot of visual artists. So we had stories and art and treated it like sort of an art opening, and people brought things that they had made. And so we didn't like unleash storytelling on people in worship in the same way. And I think that we gradually grew the practice there by just exposing people to it, by me talking about it, by the way I preached, which is quite narratively. And we did not tell the kind of stories there that we tell at Gilead. Like Gilead, there's no, people swear, people, it's really no holds barred. And people can code switch, so sometimes I'll invite storytellers into another setting and they're like, now can I? And I'm like, no, no, not here, or like you can use any language, but no F-bombs, like, whatever. So people can, so all of that matters, because one thing you want to do as you're crafting a story or inviting someone to craft a story is invite people to craft it in a way that they can actually be heard. So sometimes there's somebody totally progressive at our totally progressive church was going to use a homophobic slur in her story. And I said, I don't think you need it. And I think it's such a hard word that even here, where people may easily use this word interpersonally, like it's not a word to use from the microphone. It will make it impossible for some people to hear the rest of your story. So I think that all of that counts. And I do think that prompts, because they're anonymous, I think prompts are a great way to introduce just the idea that like any room is full of stories and it's full of stuff you don't know. And people, in my experience, because I've led stuff at like, Illinois, like regional assembly stuff. So people who like mixed politics, like mixed demographics, mixed politics, mixed sort of personal mores around this kind of thing. What people share anonymously is breathtaking. And for me, that's an opening, and then I think one thing that we could talk about a smidge is, and I have a blog entry about this, but how to invite people to tell stories. And some of the relationship work and pastoral work that gets done there is sort of, you've listened with a careful enough ear that you kind of remember people's stories, and you can go back to folks and say, we're getting ready to do a service or an event on forgiveness or whatever. And I wonder, I was thinking about that story that you told me about you and your sister. And I wonder, would you be willing to put together a public version of that story? So you're not indicating that they need to like give everything to everyone, but like, is there a public version of that story you'd be game to tell? And then you can continue to work with them. Because I think especially at the beginning of storytelling, people think if it's a true story, I owe everyone everything. And that can my ears perked up when you talked about the practice of telling a trauma story, Stephen. because some people want to tell like the biggest, hardest story. And it's like, A, you may not be ready to tell that story, and B, we may not be ready to hear it. It's also possible in like a pastoral or facilitation role to say, as I have done, like this part of the story seems very tender and you don't owe us that. And you also have a responsibility and right to look out for yourself. So if you're ready to share this, let's work on crafting it. But remember that you don't owe us. Doesn't make it less true for you to keep this part for yourself. So I think like naming that people can really edit themselves, I think modeling it. And I think that at least in the congregation here, the formal suburban congregation, that it was kind of like, people kind of like stretched into it. And it was incumbent on those of us who were inviting that work to, put up guardrails or whatever. And I don't know, maybe all that's idealistic, and there's some people who'll be like, I don't care what version it is, I don't want to hear it. But that's my sense.
Thanks. No, that's really helpful. And I didn't really know anything about sort of crafting storytelling and stuff, but our wild church gathered on Samhain, which is right around the Halloween. And one of the things that's true about that time is, or that they say, is that the veil is thinnest, right? And so we made a fire. We sat around a fire pit and just told ancestor stories. And it was one of the most moving church adjacent experiences, and just this really holy moment of holding one another's ancestor stories and honoring that. It was really wonderful.
That's great. Oh, that's great. Stephen's saying in the chat that that there's a matter of scale, and in one context, they were invited to share a trauma story that was like a 4 out of 10. And then, of course, one person's 4 on their trauma scale could be quite different than someone else's. Are there things you would add about that, Stephen, about that experience?
Yeah, I'm not sure. There was, I think, something tied to kind of feedback also that we would get, because in this one it was a practicum setting, and it was largely a room of people training to be counselors, and then there was one other that was training to be a pastor, and just learning the different ways that, if you reply with something emotional, how that might impact, versus like if you ask a question and where that could actually even pull someone out of the experience of what they're sharing, and take them just to a much different place in their brain. So
yeah, that's great. I'll say that at Gilead, neither at Gilead nor at any of the events that I'm responsible for do we give any kind of like trigger warning before a story. We do remember slightly more than quarterly to say, as part of the welcome, like, these are personal stories, and personal stories are personal, and we are a church that takes care of each other. We make space for people to take care of themselves. If you need to leave, if you need to, talk to somebody afterward, of course, we're always available. And the thing we're avoiding, a couple things we're avoiding. Sometimes someone will say to me, I think this story needs a trigger warning. And I'm like, we are not going to start adjudicating who needs a trigger warning and who doesn't. Like, I am not here for that project. And even that kind of runs a couple of ways. One, we don't want to be in charge of deciding who needs one and who doesn't. You can't know, for one thing. The other thing is that like the whole project is predicated on like, your story is a God story. We can hear and receive your story. Maybe not all of us individually, but like collectively, your story is not too much for us. And I also do a fair bit of like curation on the front end, so I'm, I would know, for the most part, I would know ahead of time if someone had a plan of telling like a story that they were still, of trauma that they were still in the middle of, for example. And I would invite them not to tell that story. But it does not come up that much, which is wild. And then another thing about trigger warnings is that somebody said this to me about a story in which an animal was injured, was abused. And she was like, I think this one needs a trigger warning. And I said, we don't do that. And you can do the work that you want to do in the story. Like you can literally say like, and this is the part where it gets really hard to hear. And that makes me think too, the trauma stories and what you said, Stephen, makes me think about the possibility of having, nobody wants to host like a trauma small group, but you could have a intentionally pastoral, you've got therapists or whatever, like in the community, you could have an intentional small group that's like hard to hear stories of the shit we've been through, or what, you could invite, like, this isn't group therapy, we're not offering that, but we are a place that can hold your stories that may not be ready for the pulpit on Sunday morning, something like that. So I think you could make a space. And I think that even goes to like, how can you grow a congregation into this practice? If you've got a clutch of people with stories that are not really appropriate yet for the pulpit or this community, you could still have a space to tell them, I think.
So I have a question, and you kind of named it, was you mentioned curating the stories for worship. Can you say more about that? How do you go about that? And when do you curate, and when is it kind of improv that you don't really know what's going to happen?
Hopefully never is it improv. But that is not how it works out. So storytelling at Gilead is something like any other congregational practice where we learn together more or less how we do it. So we offer monthly story circles that are kind of just an ongoing small group at this point. Like they're regular characters. It got weird during the pandemic, but when it was exclusively online. But one of our leadership team has this great vision, which is that Gilead would be known in Chicago as a place where you could learn storytelling, whether you're part of our church or not. And when she was leading, it was before the pandemic, that started to happen. People would come like after church to the story circle. So we offer explicit instruction. We also, like I said, any other congregation, like more or less how you pray prayers to the people. And sometimes someone goes off the rail and commandeers the mic, but everyone in the sanctuary is like, this is not how we do it, but like, whatever. It's too late now. And like, here we are. So there's that sort of collective knowledge. We offer explicit instruction. It's primarily my job to recruit storytellers. And so I send out general asks in email, bulletin, whatever, announcements. We're looking for camp stories. If you've ever been to camp, gone camping, hate camping, it's all camp, fast friendships, making fires, finding out who you are. You have a camp story. And then because no one responds to general asks, I send specific emails to 8 or 12 people and say, hey, we haven't heard your voice in a while. I'd love to get you in the mix. Here's what we're looking at. I have links from the blog that I send them. And I book tellers for each week. And I offer myself as a conversation partner. Part of how we know as a congregation how to tell stories is that at the beginning, like 4.5 years ago, I did a lot of hand holding. Like I asked for drafts. We were creating a thing and not everybody knew what we were creating. These days, better for me if you don't want me to look at a draft. That's great. I don't have time for that. I do try to send people to Story Circle or to the other people who lead Story Circle, because now there's a clutch of people who do. A lot of really great storytellers. And so people show up, and I would say now mostly I don't know ahead of time what their story, I don't know the details of their story. I often know the shape of it because I want to put them in an order. I want to put the one that's more on point first, or I want to put the one that's more serious second. So all that stuff. So that's what I do. And I do offer myself, I am available if people want me to look at a draft or talk about it with them. So, Steve, what's your question about Story Slam Night for LGBTQ+.
Yes, and I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about it and just get your reaction or get your thoughts. We've brought together a very small group of LGBTQ+ people in the community that are moderately related to the church. And we were talking, and they used to have a game night at the church, and then the pandemic kind of upended that. And so when we were talking, what else can we do? One of the things I suggested was, well, something we had done at a previous church was basically a happy hour. We go to a bar, we support a local organization, raise money for, anyway, do that. But so it occurred to me we could do that online, and that just didn't really take off because people are tired of being on Zoom. So now that we're thinking about opening up, and I've been thinking about the story concept, one of the things I heard in meeting with leaders in that community is that they don't have a place to meet and talk and just share their stories, just share who they are, because they're, it tends to be a somewhat closeted group here in this community, somewhat closeted. So it just occurred to me, what would it be like to talk with that group about an evening where we could safely share stories, and just do it with some social distancing. We still wear masks at our church. So things, it would still allow for that. But I was just trying to imagine what that could look like and how we would even talk about that. But it seems to me that might be a really meaningful approach to some needs that I heard expressed. But I don't know. I just wanted to bounce that idea. And
I love it. And I have like several titles for your event already. One is that you can rip off a Chicago event called Outspoken. Two is that you can have an event called, as we just did, I'm normally not punny, but we did devout, like dev out. And then we did stories of queer or queered faith. And that was an interfaith thing that we did with some guy we work with a lot. So Outspoken, but then because folks are not necessarily out where you are, I thought, oh, it should be like a specific invite where it's like to the tellers and then like their friends, and you call it Speak Easy. What? It's private. You like literally give people a password to get in. Like you do, it's, there's more Priya Parker stuff, but like, who's it for? Who's it not for? It is a safe space. And because folks are closeted, this is like, it's you and two guests or whatever, and some outdoor space or whatever, but private. So you got to figure all that out. But then it's like Speak Easy, a safe place for, I don't know what the subtitle is, but it's like a Speak Easy. That's what I mean by multivalent. That's good, you guys. I'm impressed with myself right now. But it's like a place to speak speak freely, be yourself, speak easy. We'll be at such and such a place, reach out to us for we'll give you the exact address once you register and whatever. And then if you're starting a storytelling event of any kind, you need to do direct asks and quite a bit of like curation toward the kind of event you want. If you want people to share around a fire and like stories of ancestors and folks don't need to prepare it ahead of time, the point is we're just making a space, that's good. And you put that in the invitation to people, there'll be time for people to share, but also you don't have to share. And also we are, out of respect for each other, going to be keeping time, you can always hit, we're going to stick to time in terms of like, we're going to respect each other. And this is like one of the few comments I'll ever make, but like we've all had the experience of wondering like, how long is this going to go on? And is anyone going to stop it? I mean, like, rest assured, we're going to stop it, and here's the way we'll do it. Like if one of us loses track of time, we're going to like raise our glass. And if that doesn't get your attention, we will come up to you and put a loving hand on your shoulder and clap you off the mic. But you do direct, if you want to have people prepare stories, then you do like direct asks and say, we're looking for 5 to 7 minute true stories about you. And it sounds like you wouldn't need a theme beyond like outspoken or speakeasy or whatever. Like we're going to tell stories of identity, basically, like true stories about who we are. Another one that's nice for stories about identity is some goofy thing about like self-taught. You can like play with that. Like people get you wrong and you've had to correct them, learning who you are,
Right.
you know, stories of identity.
Right. Right.
Well,
you're sounding very encouraging.
I'm all for it. I think, yeah, like definitely yes.
No, that's
Definitely
that's really you've just listed about 10 really helpful thoughts in approaching that, and yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Other things, thoughts you're wondering about?
I think one of the challenges is generational, because I understand, you know, as one of on the younger side of baby boomers, and having 3 millennial kids, you know, the amount of sharing is not, you know, it's not the same. And I know that each generation younger just feels more comfortable with just oversharing. And I'll just put it out there, oversharing. Yes. Am I being judgy? Maybe. So, you know, so I think for those of us that might have older congregants, or it's kind of first of all, modeling it, if that's what you want to do, for that you want them to do. Also, just say, you know, you don't have to overshare. You could just share, period. And so it's kind of like creating a culture of sharing where there might not be one. And I know that's the case for my context. One thing I've done is we've been doing Bible studies online, and I always open it up with a question, you know, those kind of icebreaker questions. And they're not to the point of sharing a story, because that's not the point of the Bible study. I'm trying to get to the Bible study. But the question could be something that will then relate to the Bible study, or that's the hope. And you know, I have to say that sometimes it's like pulling teeth to get someone to just answer that question. It's like, you know, what's your favorite fruit? You know, I'm going to talk about the fruits of the spirit, and it could just be what's your favorite fruit. But on the flip side, there has actually been some good sharing about, you know, oh, I remember my mom's apple pie, or you know, that kind of thing. So, and I just let it go for as long as is necessary. So at its most basic, I think I'm trying to do a little bit of that, but it'd be interesting to just kind of really make it about the stories. But the question I do have is like, is there ever, when there is a session like that of storytelling and it's around a theme, there's no interaction then, like the audience will then go back to that person and say, well, why did you do that? Or, you know, is there a follow-up, or is it just that moment that person shares a story and then there's the next moment?
So it's important in our context for a couple of, well, the culture of our place, our church, and the storytelling events that I do it's important to me, I guess I can say that honestly, it's important to me that people not receive any kind of interrogation after they tell a story. I've invited I invite a lot of outside storytellers. That's another thing you can do to build a culture in a place, is to tap someone who you know can do, like can either is suitable for your setting or can code switch into your setting. And you can expand the practice and the voices in your setting that way. Right. So I invited an outsider, like not a part of our church, to tell a story. It was an important story to be told in our church. And he was very leery. He was leery about church. He was leery. He was like, listen, this is a piece of art, basically. I don't want to talk to anyone about my faith journey. I'm not like available for that. And I was like, that's great. It's that, like, no one is going to harass you. And the 2 older married gay guys who were like post evangelicals who might bother you, I will keep them away from you. So that was an important learning for me early in my work with storytelling, that like there are people who are going to want to tell their story, and it's not open for like, oh my gosh, why didn't you tell her that? Like, the interaction that there is between teller and congregation, I see little of it, in part because I'm like running around after the service. I know that people connect about things, like that thing happened to me too. it's important to me that people know that their own experience is not up for any kind of debate. Like, this thing happened to me, this is how I felt, this is what I did. It was good for my life, it was bad for my life, but I did it, and I'm not available for that. The kind of interaction that is also important to me that people know is on tap is that if something was unsettling or concerning to them from a story, that they can always talk to a pastor. It's not that we don't ever talk about the story that just happened, but that it's it's not available for any kind of interrogation. So we in our setting don't have an explicit, and this comes up in a bunch of ways. What if something gets told that is triggering or unsettling to someone? And for my setting and for the way I interact with people, it's important that it's like, well, I'm available for that, but like the storyteller was willing to be vulnerable in this way, and it's not for us to question their life experience. And I'm not talking about a person in danger, of course, or anything like that. But it's important to me to kind of put brackets around it for the person, that there's a safe, they get to tell what they want of their story and nobody's gonna come after them. We're right up against it. Ed, you had a question or thought?
Just the thought that sometimes in church we won't try something because it might fail.
Right.
And I'm thinking of the congregation I attend. If it didn't work in 1957, it'll never work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes working in small groups does make a difference. We have a theology cafe the first Saturday of every month, and you're invited to show up with your story, your doubt, what's going on here, that kind of thing. And sometimes people will tell a story that you'd never get in a sermon. And some of those stories I will remember long after I'll forget every sermon I've ever heard. Sorry.
No, that's right. The last thing I'll say is that, I was in a congregation in Durham, I guess, and a guy who was probably 80 told a story, and this is the kind of thing that I keep saying for my money, this is the kind of story that I think works across sort of like mores, sharing, oversharing. He told a story about his parents buying him his first pair of shoes. They grew up in poverty. This pair of shoes his parents bought him when he was 5, and he lost them like the same day. And the grief that he felt, and it had been kicked up in him because like earlier that week, some like middle schooler at his grandson's play had said to him, "Hey, I like your shoes." Like, this thing came back to him about these shoes, this first pair of shoes that his parents had bought him, and how reluctant he ever was to buy new shoes, and how his wife was like, "Oh, get a second pair half off." And he's like, extravagant. And people didn't know that about him. And it wasn't, I think that part of the work that crafting does is say, this isn't just going to spill all over the place. Like, there's a little container that I've built for it, which is a story about the first pair of shoes that my parents bought me and how I lost them and how I still feel. And truly, 75 years later, it was clear that he felt grief about these. I think in many ways it was quite a high stakes story for him because of what he felt it cost them for him to lose these shoes. It was an extremely painful story, very beautifully told, and not by my read the same kind of oversharing that someone my age even, or someone much younger than me does. So I think you can encourage and seek out those kinds of stories that are both personal and intimate without being all over the place. So I hope that I remember to send Sandy the things that came up that in this conversation that I forgot to send her in the first place, but you'll be getting a list of sort of resources, and you can reach out to me, and I do, God willing, will be traveling again, doing storytelling stuff. So I'm around, I'm a resource. If you come this way, let us know, come be church with us some Sunday night. Yeah, what a pleasure to be with y'all. Thank you for this invitation and this time. Really
Well,
great.
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. This was really, really excellent. Kara wants to know what the name of your blog is.
I'm happy to see it doesn't have a name. I'm at Earshot Stories. It's trying to autocorrect. And Sandy will send this stuff too, but it's earshotstories.com. I think that's right. And there's a blog on there. Yeah.
Well,
thank
so
you
yeah.
much.
As Rebecca said, we'll be following up with some going deeper resources and also the recordings from this. I may edit the recordings to kind of take out some of the more personal stories that we shared, even though it is a limited group that gets the link to these. So Rebecca, let me say again, thank you so much for joining us. I know this sparked a lot for me about how we can use stories and remembering the when prompt. I think that's a great takeaway for me. So thank you so much.
Thank
You're
you
so
so
welcome.
much.
What a pleasure to meet y'all. I hope we cross paths in some other way sometime.
Hope so too.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bless
y'all.
you
Take
all.
care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.